scripture reading this morning will come from Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Genesis 50, verse 20. I'll be reading from the New American Standard. Genesis 50, verse 20 reads, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive."
This summer, Sarah and I got to visit some different friends of the family, and at first I thought it was because they wanted to visit with me, but I think it was mainly just to see if I'd actually gotten married, see if they wanted proof. And then when they met Sarah, I think I just became the driver. I was just kind of incidental, just get Sarah there and everybody's happy. But no, we had a lot of fun visiting different people. We actually visited a friend of the family, kind of an unusual situation. He was once a member of the church, and now he's an atheist. He's in his 80s now, and even though he once believed, he's come to the conclusion that there is no God, and he's been on my mind a lot. He was a good friend of my dad's, and in fact, I was almost named after him. Some connections with the family there, and so he's been kind of on my mind. I bet you know a lot of religious people, and I guess you could say various levels of that. And you probably have met people who would say they don't know one way or the other. They'd refer to themselves maybe as an agnostic. But every once in a while, you'll bump into someone who is confident that there is no God. And I want to, on our friend's behalf, to say, if you met him, you'd think he was a nice guy. I think sometimes we kind of relegate in our minds that an atheist is just a person who's scowling all the time. There's more to him than that. And it's easy to think of them as the enemy because clearly they oppose your belief that there is a God. But when you know one in particular, when you know one personally, there's part of you that hopes for them. And we hope for our friend. And when you're trying to reach the lost, I would recommend it helps sometimes to find the common ground. I think all of us, I'm pretty confident in this, that all of us know somebody who, based on what you know of the Bible, they're probably in spiritual jeopardy. And sometimes it's hard to find a connection there. And I would recommend you try to find some common ground, maybe in a sense to find what you might think of as the fork in the road where you and your friend went your separate ways, kind of go up the path a little bit and say, okay, here is where we agree, and go from that point. Spend some time there, maybe able to convince them to try the other path. I think that might be what can be helpful. If someone doesn't believe what you believe, you figure out what you have in common and go from there. Even with a true atheist. And you might think, well, what do I have in common with an atheist? It seems the exact opposite of who I am. Because I bet you believe there's a God. I wouldn't be surprised that you probably don't believe in evolution. You don't believe that random forces cause the universe. There are some things that you can agree on. I'm going to deal with one today and then at least another one next week. For the sake of time, I just want to present one thing for you to consider of what we have in common with an atheist in general. And let me emphasize this, as you talk to people, don't just group them in a category and assume you know the way that they think. Each person is different and they've reached their conclusions in a different way. But here's one thing that you and an atheist can agree on. This is a bad place. It's not a miserable place. There's a lot of good things, but there's a lot of bad stuff happening. And that's one thing I noticed that atheists notice. It's easy to find statistics. 2012, 357 natural disasters killed 9,655 people. 1 million people died in car accidents. Millions of people died from disease. This is not any news to you. I know this. You can turn on the news any night and just be kind of overwhelmed. I know of people who don't watch the news anymore because they just assume not know about it. And I'm sure you are well aware of people who are close to you who are suffering even now, and you have your own share of things that you'd prefer weren't in your life. There's definitely some good things, but in general, I think we'd all agree that it's hard living here. There's a lot of darkness. And if things aren't dark, there's always that potential for it. And I don't want to suggest to you that this is, just horrible through and through, but in general, it's a rough place to be. I've only met a few atheists, like the one I mentioned, and maybe a couple others, but I've read a lot about them because I'm sure they've kind of made you curious. How could somebody conclude such, so confidently that there is no God, regardless of the evidence that seems to suggest otherwise? But one thing, this is what I wanted to point out to you, one thing that kept showing up, I was really trying to understand, and so I read this book. It had a bunch of different atheists, and one thing kept showing up again and again with a lot of them. This isn't true of all of them, but one of their main arguments is basically very simple: this place stinks. If there is a God, why is there so much evil? You hear it all the time, even among people who are religious. And, I think it's fair to have that question kind of wander through your mind. Say, okay, why did these bad things happen? There's much more to it than I'm going to address this morning, but I want to just present a few thoughts for your consideration. One atheist put it this way. I'm going to quote a couple of guys. He said, the God of birds and trees would have to be also the God of birth defects and cancer. And as he's pointing out, the world seems to be mostly a terrible place, and his argument is, therefore, there is no God. And it sounds like a logical argument at first. Say, wait a minute, if there really was the God that we read about, why are things so rough? But if you think about it, that doesn't really address the existence of God. It's kind of like going to a restaurant that's a bad restaurant. You probably have a list on your fridge or something. Don't go to these restaurants. I don't know. But you've probably gone there and it's gone really bad. Maybe the service took forever. Maybe you had some food that was bad. When things go bad at a restaurant, that doesn't prove there's no manager. All it really proves is that you don't like the way it's run. So when an atheist says, well, how come, if there's a God, how come there's so many bad things? That really doesn't address his existence. I think that's important to kind of pull aside. Saying the universe is bad doesn't disprove God. It could simply mean, according from what they're saying, is that he's not a loving God. We're really addressing his nature. Just because the universe is mean doesn't address the issue of whether or not someone designed it. The argument only points out an imbalance. Maybe we can think of it that way. Too much evil and not enough good. The percentage seems to lean towards bad stuff. At best, the argument only questions God's nature, whether or not he cares. And some people believe that he doesn't. Another atheist put it this way, and this kind of helps pinpoint what a real atheist would say. The prevalence of predation, parasitism, disease, and imperfect human organs strongly supports the view that the designer is indifferent to us. And that's really what true atheism is about. Some people you've probably talked to, they seem to believe that they almost sound angry, as if they feel frustration with the universe, that it's out to get them, that things are against them, as if there's some cosmic force interfering with their happiness. A real atheist won't believe that. A real atheist believes that the universe is not out to get anybody. An authentic atheist will believe the universe is totally indifferent. It doesn't care one way or the other. That's what a true atheist would believe. Now stay with me. I'm headed in a specific direction because of this. A real atheist will not believe that the universe is antagonistic. Nature has no feelings at all, is what a real atheist would say. It's neutral. Therefore, the universe is not concerned one way or the other about suffering. And I would suggest there's kind of a possibility of conflict of ideas. Atheists will sometimes, and we're not going to talk about this either right now in any great detail, they'll say, well, evolution explains why we are here. The idea is that there were several beneficial accidents that caused life to not only occur, but to improve. This requires a universe with a tendency to improve. A universe that tends toward bad would interfere with evolution. You see how there's kind of a conflict. Some atheists would say the universe is a bad place. Why is it such a disaster? And yet hold to the idea that evolution accidentally occurred in this very hostile universe. Even a neutral universe would be a problem. If there are no forces pushing either way, promoting either particular direction, there's a problem, because evolution is an uphill solution. And maybe we can talk about that some other time. This is a universe that's very dark. It's full of frustrating flaws and suffering. Or is it a universe of upgrades full of beneficial accidents and mutations. You can't have both working. It's either one or the other. An atheist often stands by one particular thing. If there is a God, there should be more good than bad. If he's really there, shouldn't there be kind of a balance that leans towards and favors good rather than bad? But on the other hand, if there is no God, there should be an equal amount of good and bad, right? It should break even. If there's nobody pushing one way or the other, it should all balance out. But that's not what we find. We find a lot of bad. And that brings up some interesting questions. I need to point this out too. Please don't think this. This does not mean that the struggle between good and evil is up for grabs. I sometimes see in movies or in books, they can make it present as if it's iffy. Well, I'm not sure how this is going to play out. No, there's no contest. Satan is not just the opposite of God. He doesn't stand a chance. It's not even going to be close. We win. It's really, really important to keep that fully in mind. But emphasizing how bad the world is doesn't really help an atheist argument. If anything, all the bad indicates is that there's something sinister going on behind the scenes. I think sometimes we give Satan too much credit, too much organization skills that do not belong to him. But at the same time, if nothing but this physical realm exists, the scales of bad and good should balance. And a large part of the answer is simply answered when you are aware of your location. This world is damaged. It is deeply broken by sin, and to make things worse, it is under occupation by Satan. The condition of the world does not break even because it's being sabotaged by our enemy. His very name means adversary. The Bible helps clear things up, and this sounds pretty grim, but it's important to know where we're at. I think this is why we sometimes ask questions. Why would God allow this to happen? And these are significant questions, but 2 Corinthians 4:4 will help. It's all about location. 2 Corinthians 4:4 tells us that Satan is the god of this world. Now, there are beautiful things here, mountains and streams and flowers. Those are all in place to suggest the evidence of a creator, but this place is damaged. Satan is the god of this world. 1 John 5:19 even says, this is 1 John 5:19, the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. This is his stomping ground. Why are we surprised when bad things happen? Like one person suggested, we should be more surprised when good things happen. Just the fact that you're taking another breath is the grace of God, especially in a place like this. We're living in the same cage the destroyer is, so it's important to realize our location and be maybe more grateful for the good things that are in our life and how we are protected. And for a Christian, of course, we're indestructible. If we live, we're fine. If we die, we're fine. We're going to be just fine. Another reason things get complicated on this planet is it's covered with 7 billion people, all of who can make their own free choices. All of who make the wrong choices. Romans 3:10. See, God made us where we had the choice. That was what made us different from the rest of creation. We can choose between good and evil. But Romans 3:10 says, as it is written, there is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside together. They have become useless. There is none who does good. And then jump down to verse 23. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. When the planet is covered with 7 billion evil choosers, why are we surprised at the troubles that surface? Things are going to get rough because there's a general tendency to reject God. And there's no wonder the nightly news is not very encouraging. But it's so important to realize that God wants the 7 billion, those who ever were born or yet to be born, to have the freedom to choose. He wants us to choose good, and therefore he has to allow for the rejection of that choice, the option of evil. Just like parents want genuine love from their children. I remember my dad pointing out, can you imagine a mom or dad saying to their child, come up here, now put your arms around me and say you love me. What hollow thing would any parent want along those lines? Why would we expect anything less from God? He wants us to choose to love him. God wants the same thing. But There's something even I think is really encouraging about this is God is like this incredible artist. He can use bad things to make good things happen. Genesis 50, if you want to look at that again, as Andrew read it for us, that's a beautiful conclusion to a series of horrible decisions on the part of Joseph's brothers. And they're approaching him with great regret, saying, we blew it. We're so sorry. We did terrible things to you. But Joseph points out that God can use evil for good. This is Genesis 50, verse 20 again. This is the context, and here it comes. It says, as for you, talking to his brothers, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. Several men had made bad choices, but God used their evil choices to shape the best possible outcome. I'm trying to think of a way, maybe an analogy it might help. I think of it, it's kind of like you move into a house. Let's say you move into a brand new house, and it's got running water, like most houses do. It's warm. You have food and clothes. It's just there. Maybe it's an extra special house. It's incredibly designed. All the doors open and shut. It just seems to be, it'd be kind of silly to say it just kind of happened by chance. Let's say you're living there, but then you start to notice some bad things. You start finding dirty dishes. The beds are messed up. Some of the rooms stink. Maybe you're making tents or being a tanner in one of the rooms or something. Some windows are broken. Some of the windows are broken. And you say, think about the reasoning, if there is a God, why are there so many bad things in this house? But that skips a question. If there isn't a God, why is there a house at all? Who built it? As for the other things, the dirty dishes, the messed up beds, the broken stuff, the answer is very simple. Someone else is living here, and they're wrecking stuff. It doesn't disprove that there's a God. This world is being destroyed by the one who's the very definition of the antagonist. This world is covered with 7 billion selfish fools, and I include myself in the count. When you're realizing where you are living, and that you're living in the ruins of sin and the wreckage of sin, even the slightest glimmer of hope, let alone the glory and the happiness that's offered through Christianity, that's huge evidence that the Creator has everything well in hand. So, if you happen to talk to an atheist and he says the universe is cruel, agree with him. Concede the point. You can agree on that. I don't want to emphasize too dark of a picture, but I think that might be one area where you can say, yeah, it's true. Let's discuss why. That's one thing you can agree on, the common ground. It's a good place to start looking for answers. The cruelty of the universe does not disprove God, though. At best, it only questions his plan. But a closer look reveals a plan that allows the freedom to choose and the perfect escape plan for anybody who chooses to use that. God is allowing the enemy to damage this world to help lead people to the next one. Here's one more thing, something very important before we wrap up. Despite the situation we're in, despite the dark world, and despite the threat of the ultimate enemy, everything's going to be all right. Look at Romans 8, verse 37. You've heard it before. We're going to look at two more verses. Romans 8:37 is one. But in all these things, we overwhelmingly conquer through him who loved us. Notice it doesn't say we conquer. It says we overwhelmingly conquer. In other words, we really win. We really, really win. Everything's going to be fine. If you're not a Christian, I guess the best way to put it is we want the same for you. This world is a tough place. In Ephesians 2:12, I think it's the 5 most frightening words in the Bible. At least I'd put them in the top of the list. It's in Ephesians 2:12. Anybody who is disconnected from God, this is the situation. It says, without God in the world. That's Ephesians 2:12. Anybody who is not saved through the baptism of Jesus, they're without God in the world, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody. This world's a rough place, and to be without God in the world, that's a rough choice. And so we would encourage you to make the choice and the free choice that God has given you to be baptized into the death of Jesus. You can make that happen today. You can make it happen as we're singing this song. But we would encourage you to at least consider that option. And so that way you can overwhelmingly conquer as well. Pray you'll think about this while we stand together and sing.